That night, after he dropped Simon off at home, Fate slept at the hotel where the magazine had booked him a room from New York. The receptionist told him that he'd been expected the day before and handed him a message from his editor asking how everything has gone. He called the magazine from his room, knowing no one would be there, and left a message vaguely explaining his meeting with the old man. He showered and got in bed. He turned on the TV looking for porn. He found a movie in which a German woman was making love with two black men. The German woman was speaking German, and so were the black men. Were there black people in Germany too? He wondered. Then he got bored and switched to a free channel. He saw part of a trashy show on which a hugely fat woman in her early 40s had to sit and listen to her husband, a hugely fat man in his mid-30s, and her husband's new girlfriend, a slightly less fat woman in her early 30s, insult her. The man he thought was clearly a faggot. The show was shot in Florida. Everyone was in short sleeves except for the host. The host, who was wearing a white blazer, khaki pants, and a gray-green shirt, and an ivory tie. At moments, the host looked uncomfortable. The fat man gestured and boobed like a rapper, egged on by his slightly less fat girlfriend. The fat man's wife, meanwhile, was quiet, gazing at the audience until, without a word, she started to cry. This must be the end, thought Fate, but the show on this segment of the show didn't end there. At the sight of his wife in tears, the fat man stepped up in his verbal attack. Among the things he called her fat, though he heard the word fat. He also told her that he wasn't going to let her keep ruining his life. I don't belong to you, he said. His slightly less fat girl said, he doesn't belong to you. Why don't you get that through your head? After a while, the seated woman reacted. She got up and said she heard enough. She didn't say to the husband or her husband's girlfriend, but directly to the host. He told her to pull herself together and take her turn, saying that she needed to saying what she needed to say. I was tricked into coming on this show, said the woman, still in tears. No one tricked into coming here, said the host. Don't be a coward. Listen to what he has to say to you, said the fat man's girlfriend. Listen to what I have to say to you, said the fat man, circling her. The woman raised her hands to fend him off and left the seat. The girlfriend took a seat. After a while, the fat man sat down too. The host, who was sitting in the audience, asked the fat man what he did for a living. I'm unemployed now, but I used to be a security guard, he said. Fate changed the channel. He took a little bottle of Tennessee bourbon from the minibar. After the first swallow, he felt like throwing up. He put the cap back on the bottle and returned to the minibar. After a while, he fell asleep with the TV on. While Fate was sleeping, there was a report on an American who has disappeared in Santa Teresa, in the state of Sonora in north of Mexico. The reporter Dick Medina was a Chicano, and he talked about the long list of women killed in Santa Teresa, many of whom ended up in the common grave at the cemetery because no one claimed their bodies. Medina was talking in the desert. Behind him was a highway, and off in the distance was a rise that Medina gestured toward at some point in the broadcast, saying it was Arizona. The wine ruffled the reporter's mud black hair. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. Then came a shot of some assembly pens and Medina's voiceover saying that unemployment was almost non-existent along the stretch of the border. People standing in the line on a narrow sidewalk. Pickup trucks covered in a fine dust, the brown color of baby shit. Hollows in the ground, like World War I bombs craters, that gradually gave way to dumping sites. Hollows in the ground, like the smiling face of some kid who couldn't have been more than 20, thin and dark-skinned, with prominent cheekbones, whom Medina identified in a voiceover as a polero or coyote or person who leads illegal immigrants over the border. Medina said the name of a girl. Then there was a shot of the streets of Arizona town where the girl was from. Houses with scorched yards and dirty silver-colored chicken wire fences. The sad face of the mother, exhausted with crying. The face of the father, a tall man with broad shoulders who stared into the camera saying nothing. Behind the two of them were the shadowy figures of three teenage girls. Our other three daughters, said the mother in accented English. The three girls, the oldest no more than 15, went running into the dark of the house. As his report was showing on TV, Faye dreamed of a man he'd written a story about. The first story he had published in Black Dawn after 3 other pieces were rejected. He was an old black man, much older than Simon, who lived in Brooklyn and was a member of the Communist Party. When Faith met him, there wasn't a single communist left in Brooklyn, but the man was keeping his cell operative. What was his name? Antonio Ulysses Jones, although the kids in the neighborhood called him Scott's Border Boy. They also called him Old Freak or Bones or Skin, but they usually called him Scott's Border Boy among other reasons because Antonio Jones often talked about what had happened in Scottsboro, about the Scottsboro trials, about the blacks who were almost lynched in Scottsboro. People no one in his Brooklyn neighborhood remember. When Faith met him, purely by chance, Antonio Jones would have been 80 years old, and he lived in a 2-room apartment in one of the poorest parts of Brooklyn. In the living room, there were a table and more than 15 chairs. Those old folding wooden bars, stools with long legs and low backs. On the wall, there was a photograph of a huge man, well over 6 feet tall, dressed like a worker of the period, receiving a diploma from a boy who looked straight into the camera and smiled, showing perfect, gleaming white teeth. The face of the giant worker, in its way, also resembled a child's face. "That's me," Antonio Jones told Faith the first time Faith visited him. "And the big man is Robert Martillo Smith, a Brooklyn City maintenance worker, a specialist a specialist at going down into the sewers and wrestling with 30-foot alligators. In the three conversations they had, Faith asked Jones many questions, some intended to prick the old man's conscience. He asked about Stalin, and Antonio Jones answered that Stalin was a son of a bitch. He asked about Lenin, and Antonio Jones answered that Lenin was a son of a bitch. He asked about Marx, and Antonio Jones said now he was talking that there where he should have started. Marx was a wonderful man. After that, Antonio Jones began to speak of Marx in glowing terms. There was only one thing he didn't like about Marx: his temper. This he blamed on poverty, because according to Jones, poverty didn't cause only illness and resentment; it caused bad temper. Fate's next question was what he thought about the fall of Berlin Wall and the resulting collapse of the real world socialist regimes. It was foreseeable. I predicted it 10 years before it happened, was Antonio Jones' response. Then, out of the blue, he began to sing the International. He opened the window, and in a deep voice that took Faith by surprise, he intoned the first few lines. Arise, you prisoners of starvation. Arise, you wretched of the earth. When he had finished singing, he asked Faith whether it didn't strike him as an anthem made especially for black people. I don't know, said Faith. I never thought of it that way. Later, Jones gave him an off-the-cuff accounting of the communists of Brooklyn. During World War II, there were more than 1,000. After the war, the number rose to 1,300. At the start of McCarthyism, there were only about 700, and when it ended, there were scarcely 200 communists in Brooklyn. In the 60s, there were just a half as many, and by the 70s, there were no more than 30 communists scattered in 5 hardy cells. At the end of the 70s, there were 10 left. By the beginning of the 80s, there were only 4. During the 80s, two of the 4 who were left died or of cancer, and one vanished without saying anything to anyone. Maybe he just went on a trip and died on the way or the way back, mused Antonio Jones. Whatever it was, he never showed up again. Not at the headquarters, or at his apartment, or at the bars where he was a regular. Maybe he went to live with his daughter in Florida. He was Jewish, and he had a daughter there. The fact of the matter is that by 1987 there was only one left, and here I still am, he said. Why? Asked Faith. Antonio Jones hesitated for a few seconds, considering his answer. Then he looked Faith in the eye and said, because someone has to keep the cell operative. Jones' eyes were small and black as coal, and his eyelids were heavy with folds. He had hardly any eyelashes. His eyebrows were sparse, and sometimes when he and Faith went out to take walks around the neighborhood, he put on big sunglasses and picked up a cane, which he left by the door when they got when they got back. He could go whole days without eating. Once you get to be a certain age, he said, food is not good. He wasn't in contact with any older communists in the United States or abroad, except for a retired UCLA professor, Dr. Minsky, with whom he corresponded occasionally. Until 15 years ago, I belonged to the Tier International, and Minsky convinced me to join the fort, he said. Then he said, son, I'm going to give you a book that will be of great use to you. Faith thought it will be the Communist Manifesto, maybe because in the living room, peeled in corners and under chairs, he had several copies published by Antonio Jones himself, who knew he knew he'd gotten the money or how he'd fast-talked the printers. But when the old man put the book in his hands, he saw with surprise that it wasn't the manifesto, but a fat volume titled The Slave Trade by someone called Hugh Thomas, whose name he had never heard before. At first he refuses to take it. It's an expensive book, and this must be your only copy, he said. Jones' answer was that he shouldn't worry, and it had cost him only cunning, not money, by which Faye deduced that Jones had stolen the book, though this also struck him as unlikely, since the old man wasn't in any shape for such things. Thought he might conceivably have an accomplice at the bookstore when he pocketed his finds. A young black man who turned a blind eye when Jones slipped a book under his jacket. Flipping through the book in his apartment hours later, he realized that the author was white, a white Englishman who had also been a professor at Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, which for Faith made him more or less the equivalent of a drill sergeant, an English motherfucking sergeant in short pants. So he puts the book aside and didn't read it. People responded to the interview with Antonio Ulysses Jones. To most of his colleagues, Faith noted, the story was little more than a venture into the African-American picturesque. A loony preacher, a loony-ass ex-jazz musician, the loony last member of the Brooklyn Communist Party for International. Sociological curiosities, but they liked it, and soon afterward he became a staff writer. He never saw Antonio Jones again, just as in all likelihood he will never see Barry Seaman again. When he woke up, it was still dark. Before he left Detroit, he went to the only decent bookstore in the city and bought The Slave Trade by Hugh Thomas, the professor at Sandhurst. Then he headed down Woodward Avenue and checked out the downtown. He had a cup of coffee and toast from breakfast at a Greektown dinner. When he said he didn't want anything else, the waitress, a blonde woman in her 40s, asked him if he was sick. He said he had an upset stomach. Then the waitress took away the cup of coffee she poured him and told him she had something better for him. A little while later, she came back with a cheap brewed from anise and an herb called boldo that Faith had never tasted, and at first he was reluctant to try it. This is what you need, not coffee, said the waitress. She was a tall, thin woman with very large breasts and nice hips. She was wearing a black skirt, and a white blouse and flat-heeled shoes. For a while, neither of them said anything, both waiting expectantly until Faith shrugged and took a sip of the tea. Then the waitress smiled and went to wait of other customers. At the hotel, as he was about to pay his bill, he discovered he had a phone message from New York. A voice he didn't recognize it asked him to get in touch with his editor or the editor of the sports section as soon as possible. He made a call for the lobby. He talked to the girl at the next desk, and she told him to hold on while she tried to find the editor. After a while, an unfamiliar voice came on. The speaker introduced himself as Jeff Roberts, editor of the sports section, and he began to talk to Faith about a boxing match. Count Pickett is fighting, he said, and we don't have anybody to cover the event. The editor called him Oscar as he asked if they had known each other for years, and he talked on and on about Count Pickett, a promising Harlem light heavyweight. So what does this have to do with me? Asked Faith. Well, Oscar, said the sports editor, you know Jimmy Lowell died, and we still haven't found anyone to replace him. Faith thought the fight must be in Detroit or Chicago, and it didn't strike him as a bad idea to spend a few days away from New York. Do you want me to write up the fight? That's right, kid, said Roberts. Say 5 pages, a short profile of Pickett, the match, and some local color. Where's the fight? In Mexico, said the sports editor, and keep in mind that we give a bigger travel allowance that they do in your We give a bigger travel allowance that they do in your section. With this suitcase packet, Faith headed to Simon's apartment for the last time. He found the old man reading and taking notes. From the kitchen came a smell of spices and freezing onion and garlic. I'm leaving, he said. I just stopped to say goodbye. Simon asked if he could give him something to eat first. No, I don't have time, said Faith. They embraced and Faith headed down the stairs, taking down in trees as if he were dashing for the street, like a boy heading out for a free afternoon with his friends. And he drove towards the Detroit Wayne County Airport. He thought about Simon's strange books, the abridged French encyclopedia and the one he hadn't seen but that Simon had claimed to have read in prison, the abridged digest of the complete works of Voltaire, which made him laugh out loud. At the airport, he bought a ticket to Tucson. While he was waiting, leaning on the counter at a coffee place, he remembered that the dream he had the night before about Antonio Jones, who had been dead for several years now. As before, he asked him what Jones could have died of, and the one answer that occurred to him was old age. One day, walking down some street in Brooklyn, Antonio Jones had felt tired, sat down on the sidewalk, and a second later stopped existing. Maybe it happened that way for my mother, thought Faith. But deep down but deep down we knew otherwise. When the airplane took off from Detroit and a storm had begun to break over the city. Fate opened the book by the white man who had been a professor at Sandhurst and started to read it on page 361. It said, beyond the delta of the Niger, the coast of Africa at last begins to turn south again, and there, in the Cameroons, in the late 18th century, Liverpool merchants from England pioneered a new branch of the slave trade. Further on, and well to the south, the river Gaboon, just north of Cape Lopez, was also coming into full activity as a slave region in the 70s. This area seemed to the Reverend John Newton to possess the most human and moral people I ever met with in Africa. Perhaps because they were the people who had least intercourse with Europe at that time. But off the coast, the Dutch had for the long time used the island of Corisco, the word in Portuguese means flash of light, as a trading center, though not specifically for slaves. Then he saw an illustration. There were quite a few in the book, showing a Portuguese fort on the Gold Coast called Elmina, captured by the Danes in 1637. For 350 years, Elmina was a center of the slave trade. Over the fort, and over a small nearby fort built at the top of a hill, flew a flag that Fate could identify. What kingdom did it belong to? He wondered before his eyes closed and he fell asleep with the book on his lap. At the Tucson airport, he rented a car, bought a road map, and drove south out of the city. He planned to stop at the first roadside. He planned to stop at the first roadside dinner he came to, because his appetite seems to have sharpened in the dry desert air. Two Camaros of the same model and the same color passed him, honking. He thought they must be in a race. The cars probably had sopped up engines, and their bodies shone in the Arizona sun. He passes a little range that sold oranges, but he didn't stop. The range was about 300 feet from the highway, and the orange stand, an old car with an awning and big wooden wheels, stood by the side of the road, tended by two Mexican kids. A few miles down the road, he saw a place called Cochise's Corner, and he parked in a big lot next to the gas station. The two Camaros were parked next to a flag with a red stripe on top and a black stripe on the bottom. In the middle was a white circle emblazoned with the words Chiricahua Auto Club. For an instant he thought the Camaro drivers must be two Indians, but then the idea struck him as absurd. He sat in a corner of the restaurant next to a window where he could keep an eye on his car. There were two men at the next table. One was tall and young and looked like a teacher of computer science. He had an easy smile, and sometimes he clapped his hands to his face in what might have been astonishment or horror or anything at all. Fate couldn't see the other man's face, but he was clearly quite a bit older than his companion. His neck was thick, His hair was white, and he wore glasses. Whether he was talking or listening, he remained impassive without gesturing or moving. The girl who came to wait on he to wait on him was Mexican. He ordered coffee and scanned the menu for a few minutes. He asked whether they had club sandwiches. The waitress shook her head. A stick, said Faith. With salsa, asked the waitress. What is the salsa? What is in the salsa? Asked Faith. Chile, tomato, onion, and cilantro. And we put some spices too. And we put some spices in too. All right, he said. I'll try it. When the waitress left, he looked around the restaurant. At one table, he saw two Indians, one an adult and the other a teenager, maybe father and son. At another, he saw two white men with a Mexican woman. The men were exactly alike, identical twins of about 50. The Mexican woman must have been 45 or so, and it was clear the twins were crazy about her. They were the Camaro owners, thought Faith. He also realized that no one in the whole restaurant was black except for him. The young man at the next table said something about inspiration. All Faith heard was, "You've been an inspiration to us." The white-haired man said it was really nothing. The young man raised his hands to his face, and said something about willpower, about the power to hold a gaze. Then he removed his hands from his face, and with shining eyes he said, "I don't mean a natural gaze, a gaze from the natural realm. I mean a gaze in the abstract." The white-haired man said, "Of course, when you call Jurevich," said the young man, and then his voice was drowned out by the defeating roar of a diesel engine. A semi was parking in the lot. The waitress brought Faith's coffee and the steak with salsa. The young man was still talking about the person called Jurevich who'd been caught by the white-haired man. "It wasn't hard," said the white-haired man. "A killer who's sloppy," said the young man, and he raised his hand to his mouth as if he were about to sneeze. "No," said the white-haired man, "a careful killer." "Oh, I thought he was sloppy," said the young man. No, he was careful," said the white-haired man. "Which is worse?" asked the young man. Faith cut a piece of meat. It was thick and tender, and it tasted good. The salsa was tasty, especially once you got used to the heat. "The sloppy ones are worst," said the white-haired man. "It's harder to establish a pattern of behavior. But can it be established?" asked the young man. "Given the means and the time, you can do anything," said the white-haired man. Faith beckoned for the waitress. The Mexican woman rested her head on the shoulder of one of the twins, and the other twin smiled as if this were a common occurrence. Faith imagined that she was married to the twin who had his arm around her, but that their marriages hadn't extinguished the other brother's love or dashed his hopes. The Indian father asked for the check. Meanwhile, the young Indian had pulled out a comic book from somewhere and was reading it. Out in the lot, Faith saw the truck driver who had just parked his truck. He was on his way back from the gas station bathroom, and he was combing with his bald hair with a tiny comb. The waitress asked him what he wanted. Another coffee and a big glass of water. We got the news to Dad, he heard the young man said. It's always been that way, said the white-haired man. Always.